Whose house is this anyway? I suppose it depends on who you ask and when you ask. The notion of land ownership as power has its roots in a series of 15th century papal bulls that claimed European nations acquire title to the land they discovered, and the indigenous inhabitants lost their natural right to that land after the Europeans arrived and claimed it. Just like that. This is discovered America in 1492. Despite the fact that, one, he never actually made it to the American continent, and two, more importantly, there were already native people living here. They'd been here for over 15,000 years. But then that is the arrogance of colonization. Colonization that says, we know best. Colonization that says, our way is the way. Colonization that says, we are the chosen. And I pause to think this is another one of those times when I have to watch my we. Because I'm not in this we. This we are the European Christians who conducted the Crusades and sought to eliminate Muslims and Jews and even Irish. Those who were not Christians, those who they considered to be biologically inferior, descended from apes and not created as they were in God's own image. The Europeans who would seize land and colonize other human beings in areas all over the globe. These are the we who settled or perhaps invaded America. And by America, I mean the continent. The we who happened upon this supposedly empty land and built it into something of value. The we who in the process sought to eliminate the indigenous people of this continent and perpetrated the enslavement of Africans. It's in this attitude of superiority and belief that they thought they could take whatever they wanted. It's in these actions that we find the roots of the white supremacy culture that still poisons our nation today. Dunbar Ortiz writes that in the founding, a vast expanse of land from a scattering of benighted people who were hardly using it, an unforgivable offense to the Puritan work ethic. But by the time the British colonists from Europe began to settle in North America, a large indigenous population had long before created a humanized landscape almost everywhere. Native people had created town sites, farms, monumental earthworks, and networks of roads, and they even had their own variety of philosophies and traditions of diplomacy and policies of international relations. They conducted trade along roads that crisscrossed the land masses and waterways of the American continents. But none of that mattered to the colonists. King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763 forbidding the colonies from expanding beyond an imaginary line that ran along the Appalachian Mountains. It didn't stop them. They pushed westward anyway under the shield of the doctrine of discovery. In 1792, then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson claimed the doctrine of discovery was international law applicable to the new U.S. government. And even 9 years later, as president, he said, however our present interests may restrain us within our limits, It's impossible not to look forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole southern continent with a people speaking the same language, governed in similar form by similar laws. Americans owned what John L. O'Sullivan would call manifest destiny. The virtue of the American people and their institutions, their mission to spread these institutions, thereby redeeming and remaking the world in the image of the United States, and the destiny under God to do this work. The government would use every tool at its disposal in pursuing treaties and the courts. The Supreme Court, in addressing one of these issues of property, said that indigenous rights were in no instance entirely disregarded, but necessarily to a considerable extent impaired. The stripping of the property rights of indigenous people by legal means was indeed deplorable. Their forced removal from their lands was inhumane and beyond cruel. Colonizers attempted to force indigenous people into indentured servitude, but most resisted, and they were punished for their resistance. Their homes and villages were burned, men and women were killed, and their children were sold into slavery. Scalp hunting and trafficking in indigenous children became a profitable business for many. And these horrible crimes had the added effect, much to the colonizers' delight, of reducing the native population in. A leader, Bakanga Helis, described the majority of white men as follows: they do what they please. They enslave those who are not of their color, although created by the same Great Spirit who created us. They would make slaves of us if they could, but as they cannot do it, they will kill us. There is no faith to be placed in their words. They are not to be trusted. His words were sadly prophetic, because over the next 100 years, nearly all the indigenous nations east of the Mississippi were relocated to what was called Indian Territory. The federal government made more than 85 treaties with over 24 nations that resulted in the seizure of their land. Nations were forced to leave the lands that had been their home. One of the most heartbreaking stories is that of the 1838 forced march of the Cherokee Nation, known as the Trail of Tears, in which 16,000 men and children were rounded up and forced marched in winter from Georgia and Alabama to Oklahoma. More than half of them died along the way. A soldier who later participated in the Civil War said of the Trail of Tears that pieces and slaughtered by thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew. It was cruel indeed. According to the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, any one of the following 5 acts is considered genocide if committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. 1, killing members of the group. 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Dunbar Ortiz writes that the United States committed genocide against indigenous people. States, and continuing into the 20th century, this has entailed torture, terror, sexual abuse, massacres, systematic military occupations, removal of indigenous peoples from their ancestral territories, indigenous children to military-like boarding schools. Not only did they seek the extermination and removal of Native people, they also sought the disappearing of the existence of indigenous people. J.C. Knott wrote in the 1850s that people of color were biologically deficient. This is hard to say, but I'm going to read what he wrote. Lofty civilization in all cases has been achieved solely by Caucasians. Certain savage types can neither be civilized nor domesticated. The barbarous races of America, by which he meant Indians, although nearly as low in intellect as the Negro races, are essentially untamed. Not merely have all attempts to civilize them fail, but also every endeavor to enslave them. Our Indian tribes submit to extermination rather than wear the yoke under which our Negro slaves fatten and multiply. (1619). 20 and odd Negroes landed at what is now Hampton, Virginia. The first recorded arrival of enslaved Africans, but they weren't the first. In 1526, a Spaniard seeking to establish a new settlement brought 100 enslaved Africans from Hispaniola to what is now South Carolina and Georgia. The settlement, South Carolina and Georgia. The settlement failed in 1526 when the Spaniards revolted against their leaders. The 100 enslaved Africans escaped, their stories lost to history. So know of our story. According to Michael Guasco, who writes for Smithsonian, the pinpointing of Jamestown in 1619 as the beginning of slavery silences the memory of the more than 500,000 African men, women, and children who had already crossed the Atlantic against their will, aided and abetted Europeans in their endeavors, provided expertise and guidance in a range of enterprises, suffered, died, and most importantly, endured. After the genocide, Africans is clearly America's second greatest shame. In it, we see the persistence and insidiousness of the white supremacy culture that considered African bodies to be commodities that could be bought and sold, used until they broke down or were worked to death. We tell this story of our great land, how our ancestors settled it and built it into the America we know today. But what we don't tell is who got pushed out, who got killed, and whose bodies did much of the building. We don't always tell the stories of the indigenous people and the descendants of the enslaved Africans who share the unenviable distinction of exploitation at the hands of colonizers who disregarded, ignored, and denied our dignity. Now, there have been many moves over the years toward reconciliation. In 2011, the federal government declared Fort Monroe, the site of that teen landing, a national monument. This action followed the 2009 passage by the U.S. Senate of a bill to officially apologize for the past ill-conceived policies by the U.S. government toward the native peoples of this land and affirm our commitment toward healing our nation's wounds and working toward establishing better relationships rooted in reconciliation. That's what the Senate passed. But by the time it got to President Obama's desk, it didn't include a directive, one on behalf of the people of the United States to all Native people for many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect inflicted on Native people by citizens of the United States. And it included a disclaimer that nothing in this resolution authorizes or supports any legal claims against the United States. And the resolution does not settle any claims anyone may have against the United States. It sounds like a faux apology to me. Sorry really is the hardest word. So here we are in 2019, still living in a society in which whiteness is centered, still living in a nation where Black and Indigenous people are marginalized, still living in a nation that hasn't figured out whose house this is, who is welcome, and who is a guest. The ongoing disparity of treatment between those who arrive via our southern border and those who enter this country perpetuates the notion that only certain people are welcome here, that only certain lives matter. I don't know about you, but sometimes it just makes me tired. Because I know in my heart that it can be better. My faith tells me that. I believe to the depths of my soul that change is possible. But when? How much longer do we have to wait? We have to wait. Or maybe it's not a question of waiting. Maybe the real question is, what can I do to speed up the change, to make it come faster, to make it come now? What can it do? Well, I'm going to give you 3 things you can do. Number 1, get educated. As Dwayne Pride from NCIS New Orleans says, go learn things. There's a green order of service this week that includes several resources on 1492 and Indigenous Peoples Day, and 1619 and the beginnings of slavery. I will also tell you that an Indigenous Peoples History is the UUA Common Read for 2019-20. Congregations all over the country will be reading this book together. And I would like for us to read it as well. So I'll make sure that there are some copies in the library for you to borrow if you need them. Just watch the newsletter and the orders of service for those discussion dates. The second thing you can do is check yourself. Now that's kind of a slang term, so maybe you don't know what that means. But it means look in the mirror. Consider your own behavior. Are you perpetuating a historical narrative that excludes the contributions and participation of any particular group? It might be Black people, it might be Indigenous people, it might be people who come from below the United States, who come across the southern border. It might be disabled people. Who knows who it is? It might be people of a certain age or of a certain educational level. Check yourselves. And then the third thing you can is use our new knowledge and our new perspective to build relationships, real relationships with those who are different from you. We must do that. If we do these three things, if we do them, I believe we can promote a change and create a world where the horrors of 1492 and 1619 and 2019 won't be repeated. I'll leave you with one last quote from Michael Guasco. We choose to characterize the past has important consequences for how we think about today and what we can imagine for tomorrow.